Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. I'm here in Strasbourg, where a debate this morning with the European Parliament's German Finance Commissioner, he's the man in charge of budgets, Günther Oettinger, has turned into the most amazing, blazing row in Italy. The angry Italians, but the Eurosceptics, the majority, have been absolutely infuriated with his comments today. More of that during the course of the next hour. But first, George Soros. Yes, that's right. The name, the man I spoke about in the European Parliament last November and who I keep speaking about. George Soros, Hungarian-born, now an American citizen. A billionaire, many, many times over. Hugely successful at trading financial markets, including a bit of a killing he made back on what was known as Black Wednesday, when he sold the pound as it crashed out of the exchange rate mechanism. But Soros, the great globalist. Soros, the great believer in the European project. And Soros, of course, who since I did speak about him, it's come to light, gave nearly £750,000 to Bests for Britain. Soros, who in the past has given the Blair Foundation money. Soros, who has an organisation called Open Society that has already spent $15 billion campaigning on his political causes, and when he dies, that will get a further $18 billion. Now, normally, big think tanks and campaign groups, well, in Britain, if they've got 2 or 3 million, that's a lot of money. In America, 10 or 20 million is a lot of money. Here we are talking billions. Open Society as a campaigning group has spent more money than many countries have got. So it's big stuff. But today, he's really broken cover. I didn't think it would take time. And he spoke today at a think tank in Paris, the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he has said that the European Union is in an existential crisis. It is in a mess. Brexit, of course, he thinks is a disaster. It's a lose-lose. But he says the EU needs to transform itself into an association which nations like Britain would want to join. But at the same time as saying, look, it's all awful. I don't like what's happening in Italy. I can't stand that awful Trump fella. What's going on in the world? At the same time as saying all of this, he's also announced today that he's backing a campaign to launch a second referendum on Brexit, and that this campaign is going to break cover in the next few days. And I see this as being somewhat of a mixed message. You know, we've left the club because we don't like it. He's effectively asking us to rejoin it before they've made any real changes or reforms. So it strikes me that Soros is in a bad place with all of this. He's genuinely upset, but he has fired the starting gun for an official campaign set up, run by Best for Britain, financed with his money. I've no doubt that Blair, probably Nick Clegg and others will play a very, very prominent role in this, but we know now, within a few days, a big bid to launch a second referendum is coming. I'm asking you, is Soros's bid to halt Brexit a waste of time? And if you think, well, okay, make all the changes, and maybe in 20 or 30 years' time, we'll have a think about it, call me on 0345 6060 973. Maybe you think, do you know what? Actually, he's simply wasting his breath and wasting his money. We are not going to have a second referendum. Parliament simply wouldn't get away with it. Then text to 84850. And if you're a Brexit voter, do you feel actually that you're being talked down to by him? If you do, tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and watch us on Facebook. We're live tonight from here in the studio in Strasbourg. Now, Soros also talked at some length about Brexit. He suggested that the UK had not yet conclusively decided whether it wanted to leave the EU. Really, Mr. Soros? So what was June the 23rd, 2016 all about? What was the greatest exercise numerically in democracy in the history of our country all about? He went on to say, ultimately, it's up to the British people to decide what they want to do. We have done, Mr. Soros. We've made our mind up. We did it. It would be better if they came to a decision sooner rather than later. That's the goal of an initiative called the Best for Britain, which I support. Well, Best for Britain fought for and helped to win a meaningful parliamentary vote, which includes the option of not leaving at all. And of course, what he's referring to there is that he also funded the Gina Miller case, which of course went to the Supreme Court and, I think in many ways, has made a difference. Ali in Northamptonshire says, George Soros made millions and millions from the bank crash, and who picked up the bill? The taxpayer. He knows Europe supports corporate businessmen like nothing else. His wish for another vote is all about him and not the 17 million Brexit voters. So Ali, not impressed. John from Wales says, hi Nigel, this foreign billionaire only colludes with others to undermine our democracy. He should be looked into for collusion. Well, there's not much investigation needed, John. He is colluding. He's colluding with the globalists everywhere. He hates Brexit. He hates Trump. He's really worried about what's happened in Italy. And I'll tell you more during this hour about the almighty row the German commissioner has caused. Is the Soros-backed bid to stop Brexit actually a waste of time now? Jim in the Wirral is my first caller and a new caller to this show. Good evening, Jim. Hello. He's not there. Right, OK, Jim in the Wirral is not there. Never mind. So anyway, as I say, Soros absolutely fanatical about this European project and pumping in. And we know that nearly £700,000 already has gone into Best for Britain. We know that the Gina Miller case was backed. We don't frankly know what other cases he's funding. But is it Brexit? Is it decided? I mean, we can argue about the terms of leaving. We can argue about the transition period. We can argue about the bill. But have we made our minds up? Are we leaving the European Union? Or is it possible? Is it possible that with his money, with Blair's profile, and with many in Parliament, having never supported Brexit, is it possible this bid, which will be launched in the next few days, could succeed? Let's try a caller who we think is there. Let's try Roy in St Albans. Good evening, Roy.
Yes, good evening. Am I right in thinking this is a foreign national using his will to overturn a democratic vote in this country? He's usurping Parliament.
Well,
that's what he belongs to. That's what it boils down to, doesn't it?
Well, Roy, he is allowed to do it because, of course, he has a series of subsidiaries and companies that trade and operate within the United Kingdom. So it is perfectly legal, financially, for him to do what he's doing. But is he a foreign national trying to overturn a democratic result? The answer, Roy, in a word, is yes.
So I think the last man that tried to do that was called Hitler, wasn't it?
Well, I'm not sure that he used money. I think he used different means. But he wanted to crush us. Soros, Roy, Soros is a great globalist. He believes the European Union project is really a beginning for a much bigger and more organised form of global government. Yeah,
that's for his financial advantage, of course.
Well, it could be, but when you're 87... and you're worth, I don't know his total worth, but whether it's 30 or 40 billion dollars, but it's that kind of number. I'm not sure it's about money, but what is for certain, Roy, what is absolutely for certain, is the biggest backers of the European project are the big corporate companies, whether that's JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs, whether it's Unilever, these big multinationals love the European Union and they, of course, can afford the costs of compliance. Roy, whatever faults you see in what he's doing, do you think, given indecision on behalf of the government, do you think there's a chance that with his money and the profile of Blair and others, they could force a second referendum upon us?
Well, I have been fighting the referendum. I've been fighting it, in the early 70s. I fought against it, things like that, because I saw the danger. But I'm beginning now. I've been absolutely certain since we voted that we would be out. But doubts are creeping into my mind now. And, of course, these traitors are within our own country trying to overturn a democratic decision. And I'm actually beginning... I'm a kid of the 30s. I was born in the early 30s. And I can't believe what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, that people, MPs whose whole constituencies vote to leave, and these people don't represent them and don't have the moral courage to resign, saying, I'm not representing you.
So you are worried of St Albans, Roy, yeah?
Well, I was born in Finchley Park, London. I've gradually immigrated north.
Right. I'll still call you worried at St Albans. Roy, thank you. Let's go to Alfie in Wolverhampton. Good evening, Alfie.
How you doing, Nigel? You all right, mate?
I'm doing all right. So, are they going to get anywhere? We're trying to force a second referendum upon us.
Well, I hope not, and as you said earlier on introduction to the programme, it is the biggest constitutional thing that's happened, certainly in my generation.
Yep.
I'm just about knocking on the door of 50 years old. And
you poor old thing, Alfie.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. But I do think in the last 20 years, people of my generation have become loads more interested in politics than the previous generation. You know, we're not happy just sort of being fed by Trevor McDonald, blah, what happens on the 6 o'clock news.
I think that's right, Alfie. I think interest in politics is at a very high level across the country. I certainly agree with that. And you say you hope that they can't, force a second referendum upon us. But do you, like Roy, the previous caller, ever so slightly fear they might just do it to us?
I agreed with quite a bit of what you were saying there just before I came on. I'm an ex-squaddy, I am, Nigel, and I used to come back from Germany in the mid-80s, from 87 onwards to 92, and we used to get stopped at Belgium, we used to get stopped, coming through Holland, and you get stopped at France. There was no major dramas.
No, I know.
I want to hear positive stuff coming that we're going to have through this Brexit. And Nigel, thank you for putting all that work in, mate, and doing what you've done.
Well, I very much hope, Alfie, not to have to do it again. Thank you for your call. Chris says the public have no appetite for a second referendum. Parliament wouldn't risk the wrath of 70 million people by holding another one. Logic says, Chris, you're right. However, we're living in funny times. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC, and it's now 7:15. Well, George Soros has given us notice. Very shortly, within days, probably, the Best of Britain group, funded by him, will launch a campaign for us to have a second referendum. Soros says that actually it's time for the British people to decide what they want to do. I thought we already had. I think the whole thing is an outrage, but I'm not surprised by it. So far, people have called, texted and tweeted telling me they agree with me. But tell me that what Soros is doing is the right thing. You can do that by calling 0345 6060 973. Tell me he's doing the right thing. I'm going to ask John in Small Dole in Sussex, who's a new caller. John, hello.
Hello, Nigel.
So, what has motivated you, John, to pick up the phone?
Well, I mean, the events of Italy, the events with our democracy generally, the Sharia law. I voted for Brexit, back in 2016, as obviously 52% of the population did. Yep. And I am dismayed, and we're thwarted. I do not believe that Theresa May has a mandate to do the job that we want her to do. I know that she's an ex or a Remainer at heart, possibly, but I do believe she's a genuine woman. But I don't believe she has the confidence or the mandate to do the job as we want to do. And I do not see anyone, I know there's Jacob Rees-Mogg in the background agitating, and great, he should carry on doing that. But I do not believe we will get Brexit unless we risk everything and throw the dice one more time and go for a referendum and just prove to everybody in the establishment that we're not joking, we're not playing around.
You're reaching the view, John. You're reaching the view we may just have to do it again to finish it once and for all.
I do, because I don't think they believe that we mean what we said. I believe they think that they can manipulate us, and the EU has done an excellent job in doing that in Italy. And everywhere else there's ever been any kind of a movement to exit from the EU, they've managed to twist things.
Do you know what? They always have. Denmark, Ireland, Greece, and now they face the Italian confrontation, which, John, I predict is going to be different, and I'll come to that a little bit later on in the show. John, do you not agree with me that actually it's the weakness and the lack of leadership of our Prime Minister that has opened the door for the Soroses and everybody else?
Well, I think possibly, Nigel, she wasn't the right person to put there in the first place. But then, what were the alternatives? I mean, David Davis, I am gobsmacked by the lack of backbone, and I mean, he's not behaving in a manner in which I believed he would. I just cannot believe that I just don't see anyone else, and I don't believe Jacob Rees-Mogg does want to become Prime Minister, despite what the Daily Mail says. I watched him slap down Andrew Marr on Sunday, and I mean, he's a superb speaker, but he also, unfortunately, does carry a bit of a Lord Snooty appearance about him, and I don't believe he can change the mind of the people on the fence. So I believe Theresa May is our only hope, and I think we just have to prove to her that we mean what we said.
So when Leave voters say they're worried, they're nervous about a second referendum, John from Sussex is saying, bring it on, and we'll beat them again. Yeah.
No, I'm not saying, Nigel. I think everything is at risk, and I do think it's a gamble. But I honestly have reached the conclusion that I do not believe, until we show them one last time, there is no moving away from this. I mean, there are so many events going on. There's the events of last Friday, which I'm not going to speak about because I know it's not to be spoken about at the moment.
Tricky. Tricky.
But there is, and I'm not a big fan of that individual, but I do, I do have empathy and sympathy. I just honestly believe that they are going to railroad us into a mishmash of an EU exit or Brexit that will please no one. It'll end up being such an absolute complete mess. We will pay the money. We will
dog's dinner, John, isn't it?
Pardon?
It's a dog's dinner, the whole thing.
Dinner. And we're going to end up with the worst of all. We will stay in the ECJ. We will stay in the customs union. We'll still be under EU diktat for 90% of what we do. We'll pay the money, but we will not have a vote for one thing. We'll have no influence on what goes on, and yet we'll get the worst of it. Where will we be in 10 years' time? We'll be back in.
You may well, John, you're the first person I've had say that to me, that we may just have to do it one more time. Very, very interesting call, and thank you. Chris thinks that Soros has got ex-lover syndrome. Let him pour his money down the drain. The EU has proved it won't change with Cameron and now with Italy. Well, Chris, this is what's so interesting. They don't want to change. Tom in Basingstoke says, Soros has no chance. We will win with you at the helm. Good riddance, Soros and EU corruption. Annette from France says, bonsoir, Nigel. Why are you so frightened with the prospect of a vote on the final deal? If you are so confident of the level of support for your position, democracy did not end the morning after the referendum. No, Annette, but we were told it was a once-in-a-lifetime vote, and whatever the result, it would be respected. And you know something? It led to the greatest exercise in democracy we've ever had in our country, Annette. And the idea that frankly, just sort of 100 weeks on, they want to try and force this upon us again with all the uncertainty that causes. Most people, Annette, in the United Kingdom, individuals and businesses, say, we've made a decision, can we please just get on with it? And B says, yes, Soros is hell-bent on using his millions to derail Brexit. It all comes down to money in the end, the root of all evil. Kinley is calling from Barnet. Good evening.
Good evening. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. So is Soros wasting his money, or does he have a valid case?
I think it's disgraceful that he should even question it, because if only 30% of the population voted, fair enough. If it was 40%, fair enough. 50%, but no, it was over 75%. And I think the business model of the EU has not been questioned by the likes of Anna Soubry, because if you look at it, you're meant to put money into a system and then get more money back than what you've put in. And if you don't behave, they punish you. Isn't that what's called a Ponzi scheme?
Well,
I mean, you said it's a cartel, but you haven't actually looked. I'm being serious. You're laughing. It's not funny.
I'm not laughing, Kinley. I'm just laughing at the use of the word Ponzi scheme.
£100, you get 150 back. Oh, but all these wonderful things that the EU's doing. Well, how come they didn't have any programme for plastic usage for how many years? It was only Sky News and the Daily Mail or whoever who suddenly brought it up a couple of years ago. If the EU was this marvellous utopian dream of a place, plastic would have been addressed, but honestly, it is.
They would answer, Kinley.
When you wake up to it, you'll realise.
They would answer. They would answer that on climate change, they were ahead of the rest of the world. That is what they would argue. Whether it's true or not, you've got to make your own minds up. So, I mean, is your view, Kinley? And you're clearly very critical of the whole thing. Yeah. Is your view that if Soros and co. did force a second referendum upon us, that we would reject it again?
No, my view is that I was for Remain. I didn't want the upheaval of the machinations of the EU. And then about 6 months ago, I suddenly thought to myself, what is this all about? And I suddenly realised, no, this is democracy. You have to respect and cherish democracy. And I remember talking to some guy in a bar, and I said to him, isn't it ironic that the EU bankrupted Greece, and it was Greece that gave us democracy? And he said,
in the first place,
he said, no, it wasn't Greece, it was France. So you can't talk to people. You just can't. Really? I mean, democracy is a Greek word. You can't talk to people when they have that attitude. And that's Anna Soubry. Anna Soubry needs to wipe the egg off her face and get on with it. Unless she says no. And then how many more times do we have, as you said before, best out of 3?
I know. Well, that's the problem, isn't it?
A second referendum was worth it if only 30% of the population turned out. But it was over 70%. It was the largest amount. And if you look at the business model, it's a Ponzi scheme. And if people don't realise that it's a Ponzi scheme, that you're getting more money out of it than you put into it, people just don't realise this. They're thinking, oh, no, but with the EU, we get funding for this and we get funding for that.
It's our money. It's our money.
But it's just preposterous. It isn't. It's the money that they decide to give you back after having their lavish luxury lifestyles of private jets and dinners here and glass eggs built in Belgium. It's preposterous.
Yeah, and I'm speaking from inside the European Parliament building in Strasbourg, and yesterday, Kinley, you'll love this, yesterday there was a meeting at one of the big buildings in Brussels, one of the big European Parliament buildings in Brussels. It has not been there for 20 years. They're now talking about demolishing it because of structural faults and rebuilding it at a cost of 400 million euros. Isn't that, in a sense, a perfect metaphor for the entire project?
Can I just say, what about all the food banks in England? People are going to food banks and they're squandering money. The EU is squandering money, and the people are saying, oh, what about the food banks in England? It's ridiculous. But can I just say, I challenge you to make a documentary for whichever channel that shows all of these, because you've got more insight into it, that shows it all up, because I woke up to it. I was for pro-Remain.
Kinley, you are the man that has been on the road to Damascus. Thank you for your call. Susie says, Nigel, what the hell's it got to do with Soros? He lives in Switzerland. Well, mostly in America, actually. Why is he poking his nose into our business? I'm so angry. Well, because, Susie, he is the great globalist. Shirley says, absolutely disgusting. Soros should keep his nose out of our affairs. We should not have to vote again. It's very undemocratic. Lots of you angry. And Kinley, interestingly, a Remain voter who's now taken a different point of view. Still keen to hear from those of you who think that Soros' money will be a good thing in our democratic process. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's now 7:30, and though George Soros has told us he's going to put his money in, the campaign for a second referendum is going to be launched very, very soon. But before I get back to that, an Islamist terrorist attack took place today in the Belgian city of Liège. 3 people killed, 2 female police officers and 1 man in a passing vehicle. In some ways, you may say, well, what's unusual about that? But 2 points to make out of this. The first is that the guy that did it, who in the end was taken out, had been released from prison only on Monday of this week. He's a petty criminal and drug dealer, and he was not on any of the Belgian suspected terrorist or watch lists. And given that Belgium's already got a lot of people on that list, that's very worrying, and they're going to investigate, was he radicalised in prison? But there's a second point here. Those of you that listen to this show will know that I've advocated that we need to arm our police officers in our country. I think it is hopelessly out of date. And if not all of them, most of them, I think, need to be armed. But here's an argument I'm going to make against myself, because I think it needs to be made. And that is that the 2 female police officers had guns. The terrorist attacked them with a knife, took one of their guns, and killed them both. They were killed with their own guns. So, I do accept there is a flaw in my argument in that if guns are taken off police officers, the streets could be, in that situation, a little bit more dangerous. Now, the other story I want to talk to you about is what's been happening here in Strasbourg. So this morning, there's been a big debate. The debate took place with the German commissioner, Günther Oettinger, and he is the budget commissioner. And inevitably, the debate turned not just to money, but to Italy. Here was my contribution. Brexit is not the biggest problem that the European Union now faces. Italy, of course, has been mentioned, and they are net contributors to this budget. They pay in about €4 billion every single year. And there are signs that in Italy, voters are tiring of paying that money. They question what the euro has done to their economy. They feel they're a victim of the European Union's immigration policies, and as a result of all this, they voted in a new government, only to find that bullying, hectoring from the European Commission has been listened to by the Italian president, and in the last 48 hours, their democracy has been traduced. In the past, you managed to bully the Danes, you bullied the Irish, you bullied the Greeks into submission. I suspect with Italy today, you've now bitten off more than you can chew. Bring on more elections and bigger Eurosceptic victories. Well, after this debate, Günther Oettinger was interviewed by German television. It's an interview that will go out later on this evening, but some of it has been released, in which he says the markets, government bonds, Italy's economy could be so badly hit that these could send a signal to voters not to elect populists from the left or right. I can only hope that this plays a role in the election campaign, by which he means the next Italian election campaign, by being a signal not to hand governing responsibilities to the populists. So what he's saying is the markets will punish Italian voters for voting as they have, and dare they not do it again. He's almost encouraging a run on Italian bonds, and they have suffered a bit in the markets today. And this has led to complete and utter uproar. The Five-Star Movement, the biggest party in Italy, have called for the budget commissioner to resign or to be sacked. And of course, the Lega, led by Matteo Salvini, part of what they said in the election campaign is we're sick to death of living in a German-dominated Europe where they make the rules. And the thought of an unelected German official in Brussels telling the Italian voters they have got it wrong has driven people absolutely potty in an Italy that was pretty angry already. Now, Donald Tusk, the former Polish Prime Minister, and now, of course, the Chairman of the European Council, stepped in this afternoon and said, my appeal to all EU institutions, please respect the voters. We are there to serve them, not to lecture them. And this evening, Günther Oettinger has apologised and has said people are free to vote as they see fit. I would suggest, Günther, it's a bit too late, old son. I think the narrative, because there's no doubt that this new government, this frankly, well, without any legitimacy government, I was going to use a different word, but I won't, this new government is going to be rejected by the Italian parliament. That's absolutely certain. More elections are coming in Italy. Some thought September, others think July. And I think this theme, that actually the Germans control the currency. The currency's been bad for Italy, and now they're telling us what we can and can't do. That theme is one that simply is not going to go away. So quite a saga today over Italy, and I suspect a lot more to come in the weeks and months ahead. So Soros will pump his money into Best for Britain. It'll be headed up in the next few days by the Blairs, the Cleggs and others. They want us to make our minds up. You know, he says we haven't conclusively decided whether we want to leave the EU. Well, I thought we had. I'm furious that they want to force this upon us. But are they wasting their time and money? Or has the weakness of our government actually left room for those that now believe a second referendum is needed? David is a new caller, and he got a call from Flint in Wales. David, good evening.
Hello, Nigel.
Hi there. So is George Soros, is he right to put money into this campaign?
Well, he can afford to do so, but I do think that when we voted to leave or remain, we voted without knowing what it meant to leave or remain. And since then, it's all come out in the wash. Things like the Northern Ireland border, the loss of a potential EU GPS satellite system, etc. I do think that a lot of what we were told was based on guests' estimates, unknowns, and if people now know what leaving the EU actually entails, I think that it'd be it'd be based more on knowledge as opposed to just gut feelings and emotions.
Do you know, David, I made one absolute promise in that campaign to people, and I said, if we vote to leave, we will be in control of our own destiny for good or for bad. But leaving means that we're in control, we control our borders, we make our laws, we're in control of the economic levers. I never promised it would be a huge success. I never said it'd be a failure. I just said we'd be in control. And isn't that actually at the heart of all of this? Do we want to be self-governing, or do we feel better off as part of a bigger club? That's what it really comes down to, isn't it?
I agree that I think if we're going to leave, do it properly. Don't have David Davis, doing his airy-fairy, wishy-washy, soft play. If we're going to leave, go in there going hard. I think you should be the negotiator, really, if we're going to do it properly. But I just feel that we're going to end up with a halfway house. So we voted to leave, to take control of the borders, do away with EU law, etc. But it just seems like we're trying to sort of stay and leave at the same time. So, free movement, etc., things like that, which we didn't want to have, I think we're going to be left with. So we're not actually going to get the benefits that we wanted, but have all the downside.
And you could argue, David, that Cameron and the others that were so passionate about us staying in, they didn't tell us a European army was round the corner. They didn't tell us that they want to get rid of veto on foreign policy. They didn't tell us that the EU was going to expand and take in Serbia and perhaps even Albania. I mean, these arguments do cut both ways, don't they?
They do. But on that point, you mentioned the EU expanding. You just think about us being on our own and Russia just running roughshod over the whole world at the moment, doing what they like. When it comes to potential conflicts in the future, and not just actual conflicts, but potential economic conflicts and what have you, cyber wars, being out here on our own, although we've still got allies, etc., I just feel we'd be a lot weaker and a lot more vulnerable to other areas as well.
Well, some of us would counter-argue, David, by saying that actually the biggest intelligence sharing operation that we have is, in fact, of course, with the United States of America. And others of us would argue that really we should put our faith in NATO. I mean, what was so interesting this morning, I talked a moment ago about Günther Oettinger, the budget commissioner, and he's putting forward the next 7-year plan, David, for EU spending. What he's saying is there'll be a bit less money for farmers in the European Union, a bit less money for cohesion and regional development, but more money for defence, because they're building a European army. And this will be one of the big strategic decisions over the next decade. Where do people put their faith? Do they put it in European defence, or do they put it in NATO? So, hey, we can have all these debates. David, in a nutshell, do you think that if Soros pumping money in, putting Blair and Clegg and Anna Soubry and Ken Clark and whoever it is at the front, do you think if they were to force a second referendum upon us, that would be a good thing for our democracy or a bad thing?
Without Tony Blair, clearly that would be horrendous. But I think it would be, from democracy point of view, I think it would be wise to do so. Democracy, I don't know, I'm not sure.
You don't sound wildly enthusiastic, David. I mean, the point I'm making is millions would say, we've voted, we've done it, and the so-and-sos want us to vote again. Why would we ever trust what political leaders tell us again in the future?
I know. It is an interesting point. I think we should have another vote because it was based on misinformation to a high degree. But at the same time, it does put into question what democracy actually is.
Well, it does. That's right. David, I tell you what, no one has got the perfect answer to this, and none of us can predict what will happen in the next few months. That's for certain. David, thank you. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It's now 7:45. So Soros lets the cat out of the bag. It's coming. It's happening. The campaign for a second referendum could start within days. He's going to help to fund it. He admits that the European Union's in a mess. It's in an existential crisis. He says that Brexit is part of territorial disintegration. It's immensely damaging. It's harmful to both sides. So he admits the EU's in a mess, but thinks we should rejoin it anyway. Doesn't seem very logical to me. Perhaps what they ought to do, George, is reform it first and then come back to us. But, of course, that's never going to happen either. Let's go to Peter in Norwich, a new caller to the show. Peter, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Do you know, Nigel, it's a funny thing. I was very, very much a Remainer. Yeah. And so was one of my sons.
Yep.
And it took a month. And, in fact, the night it happened, the Gibraltar came through, and it was a big cheer in their house. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. It lasted a month. I took an interest in watching the European Parliament, And to be quite honest, after about 2 months, you could see that he couldn't run a bath. And it all started to disintegrate in my mind. And what's happened in the last couple of weeks, you had Juncker, even I had Verhofstadt, your favourite Belgian, is it Verhofstadt?
Verhofstadt, don't even start. I mean, I'm trying to enjoy the evening, Peter, please.
Didn't he? And he says, Juncker, Mr. Juncker, you've actually got this Parliament, right and left, all agreeing at once. You've never done it before because of what you've just done, getting one of your cronies. Without any voting, without any democracy, nothing. It was disgusting to watch. And no, I'm very, very much for us going. Very much so.
Are you?
Very much so. And I mean, what you were saying tonight about the Italians, I mean, what I didn't like, when you watch that Parliament, and since then I had a brand new telly, I had this YouTube, and I took an interest. And any time, like, something like you come on, or not just you, but the Swedish, and you don't realise how many countries that people are against it, in that.
Well, this is what's so interesting, Peter, to listen to Ken Clarke, Anna Soubry, Tony Blair, Sir Nick Clegg, whatever. And you would think, it's just the Brits having this silly little argument, the rest of Europe loves it. And actually, Peter, what we're seeing in elections in Hungary, in Austria, what we're seeing, of course, dramatically in Italy, is there is a massive shift going on. And these people, I promise you, they're not anti-European.
No.
They want a Europe of trade and cooperation. But the idea that commissioners like Günther Oettinger can threaten the Italians by saying the markets will do terrible things to you. I mean, this stuff belongs back in the old Soviet regime. It does not belong in 21st century Europe. And Peter, what you've said is really, really interesting. And the next time I meet somebody who says, well, Nigel, I can't really decide, I'll say, well, do you know what? There's a bloke called Peter from Norwich who went on YouTube and looked at the proceedings of the European Parliament, and he's changed his mind. So is Soros now wasting his time, Peter, if people like you now have changed their minds?
So, and I mean, if you mention Tony Blair, the most hated man, I mean, Cameron's just got to say him. I was a Cameron fan, but what he did, he just reneged and left. And I mean, they were all smirking, and that's what I can't stand. It's the smirks and behind the scenes. And when the Dutch were, that other chap, he nearly got the vote, but he didn't. And you could see the smirks there. They'll never win, and they'll never do this.
Oh yeah.
They'll never work. The Italians, you don't talk to a country like that. And I mean,
no.
My father was a regular soldier when war broke out, and I mean, to be honest with you, what was it all about? And I do agree with the one that said that I think that the euro is a German currency.
Well, this is what the Italians have been saying for some time, and I think the behaviour today of the German commissioner, even though he's apologised, it's too late. Peter, thank you. Great call. Really, really interesting. Dinah says, Nigel, well, she says a few things about me that are nice. 17 million people are behind you. Let's go all out with this second referendum. Let's show them no means no. And Dinah, I'm beginning to see this from people. I'm beginning to see people say, we don't want a second referendum. It's wholly unnecessary, but there is a risk. Given the mess that politics is in, there is a risk they force it upon us. And if it happens, well, let's go all out to win it. And I said this 6 months ago on a television programme. And, of course, that all got twisted that I wanted a second referendum. I do not want a second referendum, Mr. Soros. We've had one. We have made our minds up in the greatest democratic exercise in the history of this country. But if you and your friends and amongst the international business and political elites force it upon us, well, then we'll have to beat you again, this time by a much bigger margin. Adrian is calling from Lewisham. Good evening, Adrian.
Hi there.
Hello there. So is Soros right?
Soros says.
Yeah.
I don't really care what Soros says. In terms of a second referendum, you shouldn't worry about it because obviously you think you'd win. Although all the research after about December 2017 says you'd lose. You talk also of a European army. Do you think, first of all, we haven't bought a major fighter plane in the last 30 years that wasn't a result of European cooperation? We've already agreed to joint run our aircraft carriers with France because we can't afford to do it on our own. We're already part of a defence alliance called NATO. And do you really think France would allow itself to be told by Slovakia that it couldn't go to war? So I think all your scare stories about a European army are complete nonsense.
Well, Adrian, whoa. I was there this morning in the chamber, sitting not 6 feet from Günther Oettinger, who is the budget commissioner, who made it clear that the major increase in spending for the European Union in the next 7-year multi-annual framework is defence. They are building a European army. And that European army, Adrian, is going to be in direct conflict with NATO, isn't it, with separate command centres?
Nigel, what do you think defence is these days? Do you think it's all about guys walking around on the ground with rifles? A huge amount of defence these days is cyber. Getting together on cyber is obviously a good thing to do. So the notion that this is all going to be spent on little men with rifles wandering around the place, when that kind of warfare really died out on its own, I don't know how many decades ago, a lot of defence now is cyber defence, and getting together on cyber defence has got to be a win. In fact,
wouldn't it make sense?
You probably wouldn't be aware, but that's what GCHQ does today. It's together with Europeans and...
Wouldn't it make sense? Wouldn't it make sense then, given that the world is changing very quickly, wouldn't it make sense to maintain that close relationship with America?
We do. The two are not mutually exclusive. To be close to Europe doesn't mean you can't be... We're already close to Europe. We're already close to America, Nigel. It's possible. It's happening. It's now. Don't you know that?
Well, I tell you what, I do not believe that a European army, a fully fledged European army, can run successfully alongside NATO. And I heard that commissioner this morning urging European countries not to spend 2% on defence, as the Americans and NATO rules insist, but arguing by economies of scale, we can do it better in Europe for 1%. And I worry about all of that. I do worry about all of that. I agree with you, NATO needs to change, it needs to move on. But anyway, to the main point, do you think Soros is wasting his money in pushing for a second referendum, or do you think there's a chance that it might happen?
There's two questions there. Do I think he's wasting his money? I have no idea. Do I think there's a chance it might happen? It could possibly. I'd rather it didn't, because, it's a very, very complex issue to understand. So, but as to whether Soros is wasting his money, I can't tell you. Could there be a second referendum? Possibly. And by the way, it's quite well known that a country that cannot change its mind is not democratic. And we know a lot more now in terms of jobs lost.
Well, we do.
In terms of our currency down the pan than we knew before.
I wish they told us it was best of three. I wish they told us it was best of three, Adrian, but they didn't. Never mind. Listen, thank you. I've got time for one more caller on this subject. I'm going to go to Thomas, who's calling from Worthing. Hi, Thomas.
Good evening.
Good evening. So, a second referendum, is it looming on the horizon, and would it be a good thing?
I've always been of the opinion you don't reward a child at supermarket checkout that's having a temper tantrum with a bag of sweets. So, no, you don't. The last 2 years, Remainers have been trying to persuade people that there's been foreign influence in the Leave vote and it progressing. Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Airbus, Eurostar all bankrolled the Remain campaign. They relied on foreign money, and now they're relying on George Soros to bankroll another effort. Let's bear in mind that this is a guy who made £1 billion out of short-selling Bank of England money in 1992. 1992.
16th of September.
If these Remainers want to use that money that's been made through really, poor means, then they can go ahead and do that. But I think it's absolutely disgusting that this is, basically being accepted. And if we actually had, a political framework in this country, the Labour Party and the Conservatives, that actually stood by democracy, we wouldn't be looking at this. You've got the Conservatives that are being run by two Remainers, and you've got the Labour Party, which is,
Thomas,
as far as Brexit is concerned, is being run by Keir Starmer.
Thomas, I share your concerns. I don't want a second referendum. I still don't think there'll be one, but I think the prospects of it are greater than they were a few months ago, and that is because of a lack of leadership at the top. Interesting. Nobody came on to defend George Soros spending his money, however hard I tried to get you to do it. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow night in London at 7. At 10 tonight, it's Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you.